Hey y'all, so I have a really actually interesting story today. I kind of started diving into this whole thing and there was way more to it than I initially anticipated. So it's going to be a really interesting story. It's going to be on AA Milne. But before I just kind of jump into the storyline, I wanted to kind of give a little background as to why I wanted to start this and where it kind of came from, just because it's the first episode, if you will. So I watch a lot of true crime, and a lot of the girls that I watch, they just like do their makeup and they chat about these like true crime stories. And it's just really fun and it's really kind of laid back. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. So it inspired me to do the same thing. I was like, oh, well, I would love to do more research and kind of dive deeper into the history of children's literature and different authors and things along those lines. So that's what we're going to be doing. And today, the first person up on the list is AA Milne. So AA Milne, which is actually short for Alan Alexander Milne, was born in January of 1882 in London, England. So that's where our whole story is going to take place today. He was born to John and Sarah Milne, and he had three older brothers. Now, it's said that he had a really good childhood. From everything that I could kind of find, it kind of backed up the idea that he just had an overall really good childhood. His dad was actually a headmaster at a school called the Henley House. And this is actually where Alan, I'm just going to call him Alan. Okay. Some people in the story might have like nicknames and stuff like that. Like later down the line, his son has a nickname, but I'm just going to stick with everybody's regular name so no one gets confused. Okay. So this is actually where Alan got his first education, was at this Henley House. And it was just kind of like his first kind of like primary education. And actually his school teacher was H.G. Wells. Yes, that H.G. Wells, the novelist. So I definitely think maybe that had somewhat of an influence on him later in his life. But I just thought that was really interesting that that happened to be his school teacher. So after the Henley House, then he went to Westminster School, and he finished his education there. And then he decided to go on to Cambridge, which he actually had a mathematics scholarship. So while he was there, he actually did study math. But it was also while he was there that not only was he doing his math stuff, but he was actually working on the school's paper, which was called Granta. I think that's how you say it. And this is actually what really like piqued his love of writing and that whole realm. And honestly, it was after that he really he realized that that's what he wanted to be doing for like the rest of his life. So this is why after he graduated in 1903, he decided to move to London and he pursued a career in writing. Now, while he was in London, he did find a job at Punch newspaper, and he did do a lot of work for Punch, and he was there actually for quite a while. And he really liked to write. Most of it was kind of like humor stories, kind of geared towards adults, other short stories and things like that. And he, from what I could see, he like really enjoyed it. And then he actually became the assistant editor for that paper when he was 24. He really liked writing and he just really enjoyed it overall. And so I think his experience at Punch was just really good, and he had a lot of stuff underneath his belt, and he just really enjoyed writing all sorts of different things, especially like plays and poems and kind of humorous things. And he liked to poke fun at a lot of like stereotypical like English things. So like trips to the seaside or dinner parties or kind of things along those lines. And so he found a lot of humor kind of just like in the everyday things of life. In 1913, he did get married to Dorothy, and I cannot pronounce her last name to save my life, so I'm just going to put it up here, okay? And honestly, I tried to do some research on her to see if anything could really come up, but there was really just not a lot on her. I don't know if I would just maybe wasn't looking in the right place, but they fell in love and they got married, and then World War I happened. So Alan actually enlisted in the war in 1915. So this was just about a year after World War I had started. Now, choosing this kind of on the outside, I think would be kind of confusing to those who kind of knew Alan a little bit better, because he was actually known as a pacifist. So for those people who don't know, a pacifist is just someone who believes that like war and violence are completely unjustifiable and there there's like no reason for any violence or war or things like that. So he was definitely a pacifist, but it's moments like this that I actually really kind of enjoy learning about history, because it shows that people, like, these were all real people who had really multifaceted personalities. And I think he was just one of many who was kind of caught in the same kind of corner where, you know, they didn't want war and they didn't want that, but they did feel like a duty to serve and they wanted to serve their country. And I think they saw kind of what was going on and they still wanted to help. And so they helped in ways that they felt kind of still aligned with like what they believed in. So I definitely don't think this was like a one-off event. I think this happened more so than what we would like to think. I don't think everyone just like jumps into war, you know, like all willy-nilly ready to go. So it may seem kind of counterintuitive to some people, but also in return, through his experience in the war, it kind of just re-solidified his pacifist beliefs. Like he even more so believed it afterwards because he witnessed like the carnage of war and just the devastation that it brought. And while he was at war, he did continue to write. He actually never stopped writing, even when he was at war. He wrote some kind of humorous poetry that kind of poked fun at some of the darkness of war, which I'll kind of throw up on the screen. That way you can kind of read him if you want. But he definitely used dark humor, as I feel like a lot of people did during that time, to really cope with what was going on. And I think a lot of people do that today too. I know I do because I use dark humor a lot. I actually really find, I think, a lot of coping in dark humor. And so I think a lot of people used it during such a dark time, just finding a reason to kind of laugh and just enjoy life and just kind of find the silver lining of something. I think a lot of people crave that. And so you can definitely see that like in his poetry as well. Now, actually, while he was at war, he did experience, as many men did, he experienced several hardships while in war. He contracted like some illnesses and he just had a really hard time, as all the men who were fighting did at the time. And he actually like talked about him experiencing, he called it shell shock, which now we know better as PTSD. So he did experience that. And honestly, it was kind of that almost kind of springboarded later into Winnie the Pooh. So what happened was, after the war, he came home. He ended up having his first and only child, Christopher Robin Milne. If you don't recognize the name, we'll get there in a second. But it was after the war, so they had their first kid, and then he did spend some time writing, had some stuff published in papers and things like that. And then he decided that he just really wanted to get out of like the hustle and bustle of the city. And so he decided to go out to the countryside. So they moved from London, and then they ended up moving out to Sussex. They moved to a little farm town called Hotchford Farm, and it's so pretty. I mean, I don't know how you could not be just like totally inspired living on a place like that. I think it's absolutely amazing. That would be my dream. I absolutely love it, with all the forests and everything. And so they were very much by themselves. And they spent a ton of time here, and they actually really, really enjoyed it. And this is later where all the Winnie the Pooh stories were created and written as well. So when they moved to this farmhouse, they would spend hours like wandering their countryside and like throughout the forest and things like that. And Christopher Robin would actually bring his stuffed animals with him. And so Alan was able to kind of witness just like a child's imagination, and they would come up with storylines. And they would just have a lot of fun together, spending a lot of time going through Ashdown Forest, which was eventually created into the 100-acre woods. So you can actually still see all these stuffed animals today, which I think is really, really cool. So they're currently on display. And so you can go and see all the original, like the inspirational stuffed animals for Winnie the Pooh, which I think is really cool. So it's actually kind of a funny story how, like, where the animals went, basically, because so an author got his hands on him from the family, and then he actually had him on display in his own house for quite a while. Then I believe it was a museum that wanted the animals to like put on display, but then no one asked for them back. So they were just like kept in a box for a while. and then eventually like museums got their hand on him, And so then that now they're on display. So you can actually go and see like all the original characters, which I think is just like so cool. Now, up until 1924, Allen had not like dove into children's book, like the children's book sphere. Okay, he didn't go there. He had all of his work was geared towards adults, and that's kind of like where all of his work was at the time. But it was like becoming a father and kind of seeing his son and his imagination that really inspired him to even broach children's literature. And that's when he was inspired to create the first story that would become Winnie the Pooh. So Winnie the Pooh is actually a collection of short stories that were published in the paper, and they just like were really, really popular. And so they just kind of continued to form. Like they just kept coming because people wanted them. So the first one, like where we even see or hear of like Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh, is in Teddy Bear. So this one was published in 1924 in February, and it's mentioning Christopher Robin, and then it also mentions Edward Bear, which of course we know is actually changed later to Winnie the Pooh. And the reason it was actually changed to Winnie the Pooh was because of Christopher. So they actually went to the zoo and they saw a bear there. It was like a rescued bear that the zoo was like kind of helping rehabilitate and was like there for people to see, like in a habitat. And it was because of that bear that he used the name Winnie. And then actually Pooh actually comes from when they had like a swan at one point. And Christopher used to call it Pooh. And so Christopher told his dad, it's now Winnie the Pooh, and that was that. So, and I think what made also these stories so entertaining was because they were coupled with these really, really cute illustrations. So, and these were actually done by Ernest H. Shepard. And the way he did the illustrations was just like really, honestly, like you look at them and they're just really simple, but I think there's a lot of imagination, and I just love the way they're done because they're so endearing. And he did it like in this monochromatic style. And I think people just really, really liked it. They liked the world that was being created. And I think that's just like what really helped everything take off. And honestly, at first, Allen was not too on board with having Ernest Shepard do the illustrations at first. He was kind of like unsure about it. But as time went on, they like worked together as a team to really kind of create this world of Winnie the Pooh. And so they ended up becoming just like a great team, and they developed like a really deep friendship over time. And so, and obviously it just worked. It was like the magical mix. And I think something that people really, really enjoy about Winnie the Pooh is they were able to kind of capture childlike wonder and excitement and imagination, but at the same time there's almost this like thread of like melancholy and sadness and like reality. And something I do appreciate about children's books like that is it does kind of introduce kids to maybe some heavier topics, and so but it broaches them in a way that kind of children can kind of start to digest a little bit more, and it can start kind of good conversations. But also at this time, we have to remember like when this came out, because it came out just a few years after the end of World War One. So people were still kind of recovering from World War One, and people were just dying like for an escape. They were dying to move on. They wanted something else. Like they just needed something else in their lives after being in war for so long and having to go through the effects of war and loss. And here comes Winnie the Pooh. And so it was a great way for people to just kind of escape reality a little bit and kind of dive into a child's imagination and to see the world through a child's eyes. So then later, actually on Christmas Eve in 1925, that's when we get the first like story of Winnie the Pooh, which I think is really, really cute. And this is obviously the first like major story in the Winnie the Pooh collection. And it was titled The Wrong Sort of Bees. And this is obviously the story where Winnie the Pooh, he wants some honey. He's very hungry. And he travels out with Christopher Robin to try to find some bees. and they find some honey up in a tree, and they get this idea to use a balloon to kind of work their way up in the tree. But then Winnie the Pooh falls into this like really like spiky bush, and that is modeled after the forest that they like walked around in, because those bushes apparently are like everywhere in there. So now we kind of get into the darker side of Winnie the Pooh. Okay. This is the part where when I was doing research into all this, it honestly really surprised me because I feel like I hadn't heard of this at all. I was actually like very, very surprised. So eventually they actually combined all of like the short stories for Winnie the Pooh together and then released it in 1926. So, and it was released in October. So towards the end of the year. And it was a massive success. It was a huge success. And like I said before, I think people just really latched onto it because of just the concept and, you know, what it did for people and for kids and after the war and things like that. So it really, really took off. So just in the time of them publishing it, by the end of that year, they had sold 32,000 copies in Europe and then 150,000 copies in the US. And this is where all the problems start for the family, unfortunately. So this honestly kind of created a huge problem because people, when the book took off, they really wanted like Christopher Robin, because there was a real life boy. There was a real life boy who inspired these stories and things like that. So people were not really interested in Alan or like who created the book. They really were clamoring like for his son. They wanted to see his son. So all of a sudden his young son was like thrust into fame at a very young age. And so he was expected to do a lot of like photography sessions and audio recordings and readings and appearances, and just a lot of pressure and a lot of expectation on such a young kid. And it really just like changed the whole family's experience, to be honest. And even for Christopher, it kind of brought him like both ends of the spectrums on the extremes. Do you know what I mean? Like on one hand, what the book did and the success of the book, it would bring him literally everything he could ever want in his whole life. So, I mean, he would not go, what is the term? What's the term? I don't know what I'm trying to think. He would pretty much have anything he wants. I can't think of the phrase that I'm wanting to say, but he would be able to just have absolutely everything he'd ever need in his life. But at the same time, he was robbed of his childhood, and he knew what an anonymous childhood was like because that's what he experienced before. So he knew what it was like to be able to just walk through the woods and explore and be a kid and use his imagination. And next thing he knew, that was just torn away. That was completely torn away from him. And this in turn created a lot of resentment between Christopher and his parents. And he even kind of said later that this wasn't really something that he realized in the moment. He said in the moment, he kind of really enjoyed like the fame because, I mean, he was a kid. Everyone wanted to see him and talk to him and be around him. And, you know, he was, you know, in his eyes, he felt really popular. But it wasn't until later in his life that's when he kind of realized what was taken away, and he realized the pressure that was put on him. And that's like when a lot of his problems started, was when he started to grow up. And it's really sad too, because there was such a rift that was created between the family over this. And even Alan said later in his life that he felt both amazement and disgust at like the fame that was put on his son, because he realized looking back, it probably wasn't the best thing to do. Like, because I don't think anyone could have anticipated the success of the book or what it would have done to his son. I don't really think that, obviously, I don't think that they really had the intentions to do that to their son. I think it just kind of happened, you know, it just, you know, and then I think hindsight is very 20/20, right? So like we look back at it now and we say like, ooh, but I think in the moment it just happened like so fast. And so, yeah, so I think there was definitely regrets kind of on both sides on how things were handled, but I can definitely see from Christopher's side, like where he's coming from. And so when Christopher grew up, actually, he was sent off to boarding school. And this is where he received a lot of merciless bullying. He received a lot of bullying over him being in these children's books and, you know, the fame of it all. And so he felt the need to like prove himself, and like kind of prove his manhood in a sense. And so this is actually at the time too where World War II is happening. And so he wanted to sign up to serve in the war, but there's a big problem. He actually failed his medical exam. And so he had to use his dad to kind of use his influence in order to get him to be able to serve in the war. And it worked. This was really hard on Alan, especially because, I mean, like we said earlier, he's a pacifist. So, I mean, he's always kind of had this struggle of, you know, like war, and he didn't want his son in war. And Christopher had actually a really hard time in war. He contracted malaria, and he even took like shrapnel to the head. Like, so he just had a really hard time. He had a really hard time in war. But Christopher did return safely from war, thank goodness. And so he did serve his time in World War II, but he did make it home safe. So as time went on, everyone in the family kind of grew to resent the success of Winnie the Pooh because it was just mega. It was total mega, and no one could have anticipated its success at all. I don't think anyone either fathomed like what would have happened. And so what was really interesting is it was kind of different reasons of resentment for like different people in the family. So like for Christopher, I mean, obviously we kind of dove into why he felt very resentful towards the whole thing, but he grew to kind of accept it, and he kind of had to accept it because there was no stopping the train of Winnie the Pooh. Okay. But for Alan, he actually really had a hard time with Winnie the Pooh and really kind of getting on board with it because he just felt very overshadowed by Winnie the Pooh. He felt like all of his previous work and everything that he had done prior was just completely kind of pushed to the back burner and overshadowed. And because he even wrote after Winnie the Pooh, he wrote other like stories and plays and poems and things like that. And he just felt like everything was just totally overshadowed. And so I can understand like why he'd be very frustrated by that, because he just did not want to be typecasted as just a children's book author. That was not the only thing that he did or he wrote or he created. And so he was just very, very resentful towards Winnie the Pooh. Sadly, as Alan got older in the 50s, he did have a lot of illness, and he even had a stroke in the 50s, which is really sad. And after this stroke, he was confined to a wheelchair up until he died. And so he did pass away on January 31st, 1956, and he was 74. And really towards the end, they were not talking to Christopher at all. And I think one of the major rifts that had happened between them was Christopher had done like an interview, and so he really kind of like threw his parents under the bus in the interview and really just kind of did not talk very well about them and really blamed them just like for everything. And while I do understand his experience, I think this is something that I really appreciate about history is realizing that, like I said before, these are real people, and there's very rarely are things just one dimensional and there's one answer for something where, you know, I think now we can see maybe what should have been done differently, you know, but you can kind of just start to understand it from different perspectives and realize that there's maybe more context to what's really going on. And I think that's what's really important, is just kind of understanding maybe the context of everything. And so, I mean, I do think that Winnie the Pooh was created just out of innocence. And it to Alan, I think it was just another story that he was creating. And just like any of his other plays or poems or any other things that he wrote, to him, that's what it was. And so I don't think if he would have known what would have happened, I don't think he maybe never would have even done it. And this is honestly just something that I do really appreciate about learning like the history behind stuff, because I had no idea of kind of the dark cloud that hung over Winnie the Pooh. I really had no idea. And this is honestly why I wanted to do this series, because I wanted to learn more about these authors and the story behind their stories and their books and kind of what went into them. And I also think too that I think there's a lot of struggles with the family too, because of kind of the time period it was in. I think it was just a harder time where, people are not as open about their thoughts and feelings, and mental health was nowhere near like what it is today and like what we understand it to be today. And so, I think that also plays a huge role in it too. And so I just think this is definitely like a multifaceted issue. But you know what? I really do feel for Christopher Robin, because he especially said to at the end, like he just really felt like his whole name, like his whole identity was like taken away from him, and that whole part of him was just kind of robbed. So, and to kind of sum up on just how big Winnie the Pooh is and how big it has become, the book, so we just hit like 100 years on the book, like very, very recently. This is why it's become like in the public domain. People can do things with it because the copyright's like expired on it. It's been around for 100 years. And so it's been around a long time, and it has never been out of print. I mean, imagine that. Imagine that. I don't think there's tons of books. There's probably like a very short list of books that have just never been out of print. And so it's just kind of crazy to even imagine that. And they have sold nearly 20 million copies and counting of Winnie the Pooh. Disney owns some of the rights to Winnie the Pooh, which is what happened. That's kind of like a whole nother story on itself, is how they took the story and then kind of created it into the Disney kind of version of the character with the little red shirt and everything like that. And obviously that is not in the original books of it. But that was kind of Disney's spin on it. And it has brought Disney so much money. And I even read something where they said Winnie the Pooh is their most popular character right behind Mickey Mouse. So there was definitely more to this than I initially anticipated or thought. So this is a very, very interesting one to kind of dive into. So let me know what you think down below. And also don't forget to put down any authors in the children's book sphere or illustrators that you want me to kind of dive into, or any kind of facets of children's book literature that you want me to kind of dive into a little bit more, because I think this is going to be really interesting. I think this is a good one to start on, because there was way more to this than I thought. And I think this will kind of open up our eyes to maybe the history of these books, and they may not all be super innocent, but I think it really helps to give us context into the history of all these things. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.